Margaret, a 73-year-old widow, discovers that her daughter-in-law Sarah has secretly sold the family ranch worth $3 million, a property that held 4 generations of memories and was meant to stay in the family forever. When Sarah presents her with a shocking $16,000 check as her share, Margaret realizes she's been betrayed by the woman she trusted like her own daughter. What follows is a devastating journey through family manipulation, legal battles, and the painful discovery of how greed can destroy the bonds she thought were unbreakable. But Margaret isn't ready to give up without a fight. Tits, I never thought I'd live to see the day when someone would steal my entire life's work with a smile on their face and a check for $16,000. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 73 years old. For the past 50 years, I've called Willowbrook Ranch in Montana my home. 3,000 acres of rolling hills, pristine lakes, and memories that span 4 generations of my family. My late husband, Robert, and I built this place from nothing, turning it into one of the most beautiful cattle ranches in the state. But today, as I sit in my kitchen staring at this pathetic check, I realize I've been living with a snake. The morning started like any other. I was feeding the chickens behind the main house when I saw Sarah's BMW pulling up the gravel driveway. Sarah is my daughter-in-law, married to my son Michael for 8 years now. She's always been ambitious, let's say, but I never imagined she was capable of what I was about to discover. "Good morning, Margaret," she called out, her voice sickeningly sweet as she approached me with a manila envelope clutched in her manicured hands. "I have some wonderful news to share with you." I should have known right then. Sarah never brought me good news without wanting something in return. But like the fool I apparently am, I invited her inside for coffee. "You know how you've been struggling with the ranch expenses lately," she began, settling into Robert's old chair at the kitchen table. The audacity of it made my skin crawl, but I bit my tongue. "Well, I've found a solution to all your problems." I poured 2 cups of coffee, my hands already starting to shake with a premonition I couldn't name. "What kind of solution, dear?" Sarah's smile was radiant, like she was about to announce she'd won the lottery. "I sold the ranch, Margaret, for $3 million. Cash deal, closed yesterday." The coffee mug slipped from my hands and shattered against the hardwood floor, sending hot liquid splashing across my ankles. But I barely felt the burn. Her words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "You what?" "I know it's a shock, but think about it rationally," Sarah continued, completely unbothered by my reaction. "You're in your 70s. This place is way too much for you to handle alone. The maintenance costs are astronomical, and frankly, it's not practical for someone your age." I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. "Sarah, this ranch isn't yours to sell. How could you possibly—" "Actually, it was," she interrupted, pulling out a stack of legal documents. "Remember when you signed those papers last year? The ones I said were just to help with the property taxes and estate planning." My blood turned to ice. I remembered those papers. Sarah had brought them to me when I was recovering from pneumonia, barely able to sit up in bed. She'd explained them as routine paperwork, something to make things easier for Michael and her in case something happened to me. I'd trusted her completely. "Those papers transferred ownership of the ranch to Michael and me," Sarah explained with the casual tone someone might use to discuss the weather. "As joint tenants with rights of survivorship. It was all perfectly legal." I felt like I was drowning in my own kitchen. "But Michael, he would never—" "He knows what this place means to our family." Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "Michael is very busy with his medical practice in Seattle. He agreed this was the best decision for everyone involved. The ranch was becoming a financial burden, and this way, we can all move forward." "Where is my son?" I demanded, finding my voice through the shock. "I want to speak with Michael right now. He's in surgery today, but he sends his love. And look," Sarah reached back into the envelope and pulled out a check, sliding it across the table toward me. "Your share of the proceeds, $16,000. That should be more than enough to get you settled in a nice senior living community." I stared at the check like it was written in blood. $16,000 for a ranch worth $3 million, for 50 years of my life, for my husband's grave on the hill overlooking the south pasture, for the apple trees we planted on our first anniversary, for the barn where my grandchildren learned to ride horses. "You're giving me $16,000 for a $3 million property." My voice came out as a whisper. "Well, you have to understand, Margaret, There were significant debts against the property. Taxes, maintenance costs, legal fees for the sale. It all adds up. Plus, Michael and I had to consider the years of financial support we've provided, helping with your expenses since Robert passed. This is actually quite generous, all things considered. I knew she was lying. Every word that came out of her mouth was poison wrapped in silk. The ranch had been debt-free for over a decade. Robert had made sure of that before he died. And the financial support she mentioned? That was a few $100s here and there when I was too proud to ask for help with medical bills. "You can't do this," I said, standing up on shaking legs. "This is my home, my family's legacy. You can't just steal it from me." Sarah's mask finally slipped, and I saw the cold calculation underneath. "I'm not stealing anything, Margaret. I'm protecting my family's future. That ranch was going to be nothing but a money pit for Michael and me to inherit someday. This way, we get the value now, when we can actually use it." "Your family?" I felt rage building in my chest like a wildfire. "This ranch has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather homesteaded this land. My grandfather expanded it. My father modernized it. Robert and I turned it into something special. This isn't your family legacy, it's mine." Sarah stood up, smoothing down her designer dress. "Well, it's not your family's anymore. The new owners take possession next month. I'd suggest you start packing." She paused at the kitchen door. "Oh, and Margaret, I'd strongly advise you not to make this more difficult than it needs to be. You signed the papers willingly. Any attempt to challenge this legally would be expensive and unsuccessful." With that, she walked out of my house that was no longer mine, leaving me standing in a puddle of spilled coffee with a $16,000 check in my trembling hands. I don't know how long I stood there. The sun moved across the kitchen window, casting different shadows on the walls Robert and I had painted together 30 years ago. The walls where we'd hung pictures of our children, our grandchildren, our life together. Finally, I walked to the phone and dialed Michael's office in Seattle. His receptionist told me he was in surgery and wouldn't be available until evening. I left a message, though I suspected he already knew exactly why I was calling. Then I did something I hadn't done since Robert's funeral 6 years ago. I sat down in his old recliner and cried. Not delicate tears, but ugly, gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to tear something loose inside my chest. When the tears finally stopped, I looked around the living room that had been my sanctuary for 5 decades. The handmade quilt Robert's mother had given us as a wedding gift was still draped over the back of the sofa. The family photos covered every surface. Michael as a gap-toothed little boy, his sister Jennifer before cancer took her too young. The grandchildren I rarely saw anymore because they lived so far away. This was more than a house. It was the physical manifestation of my entire adult life. Every board, every nail, every improvement had been chosen with love and intention. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals. The bedroom where both my children had been born during difficult winters when we couldn't get to the hospital in town. The porch where Robert and I had spent countless evenings watching the sunset over our land. And Sarah had sold it like it was nothing more than a commodity. I picked up the check again, staring at the amount. $16,000 wouldn't even cover 6 months in most senior living facilities. It certainly wouldn't buy me a new home anywhere decent. Sarah knew that. This wasn't ignorance or poor judgment. It was calculated cruelty, designed to force me into complete dependence on them. The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. For a moment, my heart leaped, hoping it might be Michael calling to explain that this was all some terrible mistake. Instead, I heard Sarah's voice on my answering machine. "Hi, Margaret, it's me again. I forgot to mention, the new owners would like to do a property inspection tomorrow morning at 10. Please make sure everything is tidy and accessible. Also, you'll need to start making arrangements for your personal belongings. The moving truck should probably come within the next 2 weeks. Thanks." The casual tone, like she was asking me to water her plants while she went on vacation, made me physically sick. I stumbled to the bathroom and barely made it to the toilet before my stomach emptied itself. As I knelt on the cold tile floor, something inside me shifted. The shock was wearing off, and underneath it was a rage unlike anything I'd ever felt. Sarah thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman who would quietly accept her fate and shuffle off to die in some sterile facility. She was wrong. I might be 73 years old, but I wasn't dead yet. And I wasn't going down without a fight. This ranch was my life's work, my family's legacy, and my husband's final resting place. If Sarah wanted to steal it from me, she was going to discover that this old woman still had plenty of fight left in her. I stood up, splashed cold water on my face, and walked back to the kitchen. The check was still lying on the table where Sarah had left it. I picked it up, walked to the back door, and stepped out onto the porch that overlooked the pasture, where our cattle grazed peacefully in the late afternoon sun. Then I tore the check into tiny pieces and let the wind scatter them across the land that was still, legally or not, my home. The war had begun. The sleepless night that followed Sarah's betrayal felt like the longest of my life. I sat in Robert's chair until dawn, staring out the window at land that apparently no longer belonged to me, replaying every conversation, every interaction, every moment when I should have seen this coming. At exactly 7 a.m., I called Michael's direct line at the hospital. This time, I wasn't taking no for an answer. Mom? His voice was cautious, guarded. He already knew. Michael Robert Chen, I said, using his full name the way I had when he was in trouble as a child. You have exactly one chance to explain to me what happened to my ranch before I hire a lawyer and make this the ugliest family fight in Montana history. There was a long pause. I could hear the background noise of a hospital, beeping machines, muffled announcements, the kind of sounds that had become my son's daily soundtrack since he'd specialized in cardiac surgery. Mom, I know this is hard. Hard? I cut him off. Hard is losing your husband of 47 years. Hard is watching your daughter die of cancer at 32. This isn't hard, Michael. This is theft. It's not theft. The ranch was becoming a financial drain. The property taxes alone are over $30,000 a year, and the maintenance costs. Don't you dare lie to me. My voice was steady now, cold as the Montana winter. I know exactly what this ranch costs to run because I've been running it for 50 years. The cattle operation covers all expenses and has for decades. Your father made sure of that. Another pause. When Michael spoke again, his voice was defensive. Mom, you're 73. You can't keep living out there alone. What if something happens? What if you fall or have a medical emergency? The nearest hospital is 45 minutes away. So your solution was to steal my home and leave me homeless? You're not homeless. Sarah found you a beautiful assisted living facility in Billings. It has everything you need. Medical care on site, activities, people your own age. People my own age waiting to die, I snapped. Michael, this ranch is where your father is buried. It's where you and Jennifer were born. It's where your children learned to ride horses and catch fireflies and understand what it means to be part of something bigger than themselves. How could you sell it to strangers? I heard him take a shaky breath. Because I can't take care of two families, Mom. I have a wife and two teenagers to think about. College tuition, mortgages, retirement planning. The ranch was it was an asset that wasn't generating real income anymore. An asset. The words tasted bitter in my mouth. Your family's legacy is just an asset to you. That's not fair. What's not fair is your wife forging my signature on legal documents while I was sick with pneumonia. She didn't forge anything. Michael's voice rose. You signed those papers yourself. Sarah explained everything to you. She explained that they were for tax purposes and estate planning. She never mentioned anything about transferring ownership. If I'd known what I was really signing, do you think I would have done it? Silence stretched between us. Finally, Michael spoke, and his voice was smaller, younger. Mom, I'm sorry, I really am. But it's done now. The sale is final. Maybe it's time to move forward. Move forward to what? A sterile room in an old folks' home where I can sit in a circle and play bingo until I die. Michael, I raised you better than this. You did raise me better than this, he admitted quietly. But I'm in an impossible position here. Sarah is my wife. She's the mother of my children. She truly believes this is what's best for our family. And what about me? Am I not your family anymore? The question hung in the air like smoke. I could practically hear Michael's internal struggle through the phone line. Of course you're my family, Mom, but I have to think about my wife and kids first. That's what Dad would have wanted. The mention of Robert hit me like a physical blow. Your father would have wanted you to protect this land for your children and their children. He worked himself half to death building something that would last forever, and you sold it for money you don't even need. How do you know what I need? Michael's voice turned sharp again. Do you know how much it costs to live in Seattle? Do you know what private school tuition runs these days? Or what it's like to have a wife who grew up with money and expects a certain lifestyle? And there it was, the truth underneath all the justifications about my safety and the ranch's expenses. Sarah wanted a certain lifestyle, and my family's legacy was the price Michael was willing to pay for it. I see, I said quietly. This was never about me or the ranch. This was about keeping your wife happy. Mom, that's not... It is exactly that. I felt something breaking inside me, but it wasn't grief anymore. It was the last thread of hope I'd been holding on to, that my son might still have some integrity left. You sold your father's grave, Michael. You sold the place where your sister took her first steps. You sold the barn where you learned to drive. You sold it all to buy your wife more designer handbags and spa treatments. You're being unfair. I'm being honest. Something you apparently forgot how to do. I took a deep breath. I want you to know something, Michael. When you were 8 years old, you fell through the ice on the pond behind the house. Your father and I pulled you out and rushed you to the hospital. You were hypothermic, barely conscious. While you were lying in that emergency room, I made a promise to God that if He let you live, I would spend the rest of my life making sure you had everything you needed to be happy and successful. I paused, letting the memories settle between us. I kept that promise. I worked 18-hour days on this ranch to pay for your education. I sold my grandmother's jewelry to help fund your medical school. I missed vacations, new clothes, 1,000 little luxuries so that you could have opportunities your father and I never had. And I did it gladly, because that's what mothers do. Michael was quiet now, and I thought I might have heard a small sob. But I never imagined that the son I sacrificed so much for would grow up to steal from his own mother. Mom, please. I have one question for you, Michael, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. If your father were alive today, would you be able to look him in the eye and explain why you sold his life's work to make your wife happy? The silence stretched so long, I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I can't undo this, Mom, even if I wanted to. The contracts are signed. The money has been transferred. The new owners take possession in 3 weeks. Then you've made your choice, I said, and I've made mine. What does that mean? It means that if you want to treat me like a helpless old woman who can be discarded when she becomes inconvenient, then you're about to learn just how inconvenient I can really be. I hung up the phone before he could respond. If this part also touched your heart, tell me from which place in the world you're listening to this story. The house felt different after that conversation. Not just empty, but somehow smaller, like the walls were closing in on me. I walked through each room, touching familiar objects, trying to memorize details I'd taken for granted for 50 years. In the master bedroom, I stopped in front of the wedding photo on my dresser. Robert and I looked impossibly young, full of dreams and determination. We'd had our whole lives ahead of us, and we'd built something beautiful together. Now our son had sold it like it meant nothing. I picked up the photo and held it against my chest. I'm sorry, sweetheart, I whispered. I failed. I let her steal everything we worked for. But even as I said the words, I could almost hear Robert's voice in my head, gruff and practical as always. Stop feeling sorry for yourself, Maggie. You're not dead yet. Fight back. He was right. Self-pity wouldn't save my home or honor his memory. Action would. I walked to the closet and pulled out the metal filing box where I kept all our important papers. If Sarah thought she could outsmart me with legal trickery, she was about to discover that I hadn't been married to a methodical man for 47 years without learning a thing or two about documentation. I spread the papers across the kitchen table, the original deed to the ranch, insurance policies, tax records, copies of every improvement and expansion we'd made over the years. And there, near the bottom of the pile, I found what I was looking for. Robert's will. I'd read it dozens of times after his death, but now I studied it with fresh eyes. The language was clear. The ranch was to remain in the family in perpetuity, passing to our children and their children, never to be sold to outsiders. Sarah's papers might have given her legal ownership, but they couldn't override Robert's explicit wishes about what should happen to the property. There had to be a way to challenge this, some legal loophole that could undo what she'd done. I reached for the phone again. This time I called the one person I should have called first. Jameson, Burke and Associates, came the professional voice. This is Margaret Chen. I need to speak with James Jameson immediately. Tell him it's about Robert Chen's estate and it's an emergency. James had been Robert's lawyer for over 20 years, handling everything from property acquisitions to business contracts. If anyone could help me find a way out of this nightmare, it would be him. Margaret? James's voice was warm but concerned when he came on the line. What's going on? James, someone has stolen my ranch, and I need your help to get it back. James Jameson's office hadn't changed much in the 20 years I'd been visiting it. The same heavy oak desk, the same law books lining the walls, the same smell of leather and old paper that somehow made serious conversations feel more legitimate. But today, sitting across from him with Sarah's forged documents spread between us, I felt like I was drowning in quicksand. Margaret, I'm going to be straight with you, James said, removing his reading glasses and rubbing his tired eyes. What Sarah did was legally questionable, morally reprehensible, but unfortunately, technically valid. My heart sank. What do you mean, technically valid? The documents you signed do transfer ownership to Michael and Sarah as joint tenants. The language is clear, and your signature is genuine. The fact that Sarah misrepresented what you were signing might constitute fraud, but proving that in court would be extremely difficult. I felt the last flicker of hope dying in my chest. So there's nothing we can do? James held up a weathered hand. I didn't say that. I said it would be difficult, not impossible. But Margaret, you need to understand what you'd be getting into. This would be a long, expensive legal battle with no guarantee of success, and it would destroy what's left of your relationship with your son. What relationship? I laughed bitterly. My son sold my home out from under me for money to keep his wife in designer shoes. I think that relationship is already pretty well destroyed. James leaned back in his chair, studying me with the careful attention of someone who'd known me for decades. Tell me exactly what happened. Every detail, from the beginning. For the next hour, I walked him through everything. Sarah's visit when I was sick with pneumonia, her explanation of the documents, the casual way she'd announced the sale, the insulting $16,000 check. James took notes, asking pointed questions about dates, witnesses, exactly what Sarah had said and when. The timing is interesting, he mused when I finished. She brought you these papers while you were recovering from pneumonia, correct? Barely able to sit up in bed. That's right, I was on heavy medication for the lung infection, barely coherent half the time. That could be significant. If we can prove you weren't mentally competent to understand what you were signing due to illness and medication, we might have grounds for arguing the documents are invalid. A spark of hope flickered in my chest. You think that would work? Maybe. We'd need medical records showing your condition at the time, documentation of the medications you were taking, possibly testimony from your doctor about how those drugs might have affected your cognitive abilities. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But Margaret, even if we can challenge the validity of the ownership transfer, we still have another problem. The ranch has already been sold to a third party. The spark died as quickly as it had appeared. Meaning what? Meaning that even if we prove Sarah had no right to sell the property, the new owners bought it in good faith. They're innocent parties who paid fair market value for what they believed was a legitimate transaction. Getting the property back from them would be a separate legal battle entirely. I slumped in my chair, feeling every one of my 73 years. So even if we win, I still lose my home. Not necessarily. If we can prove fraud, Sarah and Michael would be financially liable for the damages. We could force them to buy equivalent property for you, or pay you the full market value of what was stolen. But getting your actual ranch back, he shook his head, that would be much more complicated. The unfairness of it all crashed over me like a wave. Sarah commits fraud, steals my home, and even if I can prove it, she gets to keep the money while I'm forced to start over somewhere else. At 73 years old, there's something else you should know, James continued gently. I did some checking after you called. The buyers of your ranch, they're developers from California. They're planning to subdivide the property into luxury home sites. Willowbrook Ranch is going to become Willowbrook Estates. 50 custom homes starting at $2 million each. I felt physically sick. The land where 4 generations of my family had lived and worked, where my husband was buried, where my children had learned to love the earth beneath their feet. It was going to become a playground for wealthy strangers. They can't do that, I whispered. There are zoning restrictions, agricultural preservation laws, which Sarah apparently helped them navigate. She's been working on this sale for over a year, Margaret. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. She's been planning this carefully, systematically removing every obstacle. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. A year of planning, a year of smiling at family dinners, asking about my health, pretending to care while she plotted to steal everything I'd worked for. What kind of timeline are we looking at if I decide to fight this? I asked. 2 to 3 years minimum, possibly longer. And we're talking about significant legal costs. Probably $200,000 or more, even if we win. If we lose, you could be liable for their legal fees too. $200,000. I didn't have that kind of money. The ranch had always provided for our needs, but we'd never been cash rich. Most of our wealth was tied up in the land itself, the land that Sarah had just stolen. However, James continued, there might be another option. Something more immediate, though admittedly more dramatic. I looked up at him hopefully. What kind of option? We could file an emergency injunction to stop the transfer of the property to the new owners. If we can convince a judge that there's credible evidence of fraud, we might be able to freeze the sale until the courts can sort out who really owns what. Would that work? Maybe. The key would be demonstrating immediate and irreparable harm, which we have since your family home is being stolen and your husband's grave sits on the property. We'd need to move fast, though. The new owners take possession in less than 3 weeks. For the first time since Sarah's visit, I felt a surge of determination. Then let's do it. James studied my face carefully. Margaret, you need to understand what you'd be signing up for. Sarah and Michael will fight back hard. This will get ugly, public, and personal. Your family will be torn apart. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Robert's grave on the hill, about the apple trees we'd planted together, about the barn where my grandchildren had learned to ride. I thought about 47 years of marriage and 50 years of building something meaningful from nothing. My family was already torn apart the moment my son chose his wife's greed over his mother's home, I said quietly. At least this way, I go down fighting. James nodded slowly. Then we'd better get started. I'll need you to gather everything you can find. Medical records from your pneumonia, documentation of your mental state at the time you signed those papers, any witnesses who can testify about Sarah's misrepresentations. We'll file the emergency motion first thing tomorrow morning. As I left his office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't felt since Sarah's devastating visit. Hope. It was fragile, tentative, but real. I might be 73 years old. I might be facing the fight of my life against my own family, but I wasn't giving up. The drive back to the ranch took me through town, past the diner where Robert and I had eaten breakfast every Sunday for 20 years, past the hardware store where we'd bought supplies for countless home improvement projects, past the church where we'd been married and where Jennifer's funeral had been held. Everyone in this community knew the Chen family. We'd been part of the fabric of this place for half a century. The idea that strangers would soon own our land, that developers would tear down everything we'd built to make room for millionaires' vacation homes, felt like watching the death of everything I'd ever loved. But as I turned up the gravel drive toward home, I made myself a promise. Sarah might have caught me off guard once, but I wasn't the helpless old woman she thought I was. I'd survived the death of my daughter, the loss of my husband, 40 years of harsh Montana winters, and economic downturns that had broken stronger people than me. If Sarah wanted a war, she was about to get one. The house felt different when I walked through the door, not just sad now, but charged with purpose. I had work to do, documents to gather, evidence to compile, a case to build. For the first time in days, I had a plan. I started in the master bedroom, pulling out the medical files from my pneumonia treatment. The prescription bottles were still in the medicine cabinet. Strong antibiotics, pain medication, steroids that had left me disoriented and confused for weeks. Perfect evidence of why I hadn't been mentally competent to understand what I was signing. Next, I called Dr. Martinez, my physician for the past 15 years. His nurse promised he'd call back within the hour. Then I started making a list of everyone who'd visited me during my illness, everyone who could testify about my condition when Sarah had brought those papers. What comes next is even stronger. And to not miss the ending, tap the subscribe button now. It's free and you'll be with me in every new story. As the sun set over the mountains that had framed my view for 50 years, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by evidence of Sarah's betrayal. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't crying. I was planning. And Margaret Chen had always been very, very good at planning. The courthouse in Billings felt like enemy territory as I walked up the marble steps with James beside me. 3 days had passed since our meeting in his office, and we'd worked around the clock to prepare our emergency injunction. My hands shook as I clutched the folder containing medical records, witness statements, and every piece of evidence we could gather in such a short time. "Remember, Margaret," James whispered as we approached the courtroom doors. "Stay calm, no matter what they say. Don't react, don't argue, let me do the talking." I nodded, though my stomach churned with anxiety. I hadn't slept more than a few hours each night, poring over documents and making phone calls to anyone who might help our case. Dr. Martinez had been invaluable, providing detailed records of my medication regimen during the pneumonia and a sworn statement about how the drugs could have impaired my judgment. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everything look sickly yellow. But what made my breath catch in my throat was seeing Michael and Sarah sitting at the defendant's table with their lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman who looked like she ate people like me for breakfast. Michael wouldn't meet my eyes, staring instead at his hands folded on the table. But Sarah looked directly at me with what I could only describe as smug satisfaction. She was wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, her jewelry sparkling under the harsh lights. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hernandez," called the bailiff. Judge Hernandez was a woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She settled into her chair and immediately dove into business. "This is an emergency hearing regarding Chen versus Chen and Murdoch," she began, consulting her notes. "The plaintiff is seeking an injunction to prevent the transfer of real property pending resolution of fraud allegations. Mr. Jameson, you may proceed with your opening statement." James stood, and I felt a surge of gratitude for his steady presence. "Your Honor, this case represents one of the most callous examples of elder fraud I've encountered in 30 years of practice. Mrs. Margaret Chen, a 73-year-old widow recovering from a severe case of pneumonia, was deliberately deceived into signing documents that transferred ownership of her family's ranch worth $3 million while she was heavily medicated and barely coherent." He gestured toward our evidence table. "We have medical records showing that at the time these documents were signed, Mrs. Chen was taking multiple prescription drugs that would have severely impaired her cognitive abilities. We have witness testimony describing her mental state as confused and disoriented. And we have proof that the defendant, Sarah Murdoch Chen, deliberately misrepresented the nature of these documents." Sarah's lawyer, who'd introduced herself as Monica Blackwood, rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Jameson is making arguments rather than presenting facts. There's no evidence of deliberate deception, and Mrs. Chen's signature on these documents is genuine and legally binding." "Sustained," Judge Hernandez said crisply. "Mr. Jameson, please stick to the facts relevant to your injunction request." James nodded. "Your Honor, the facts are simple. Mrs. Chen signed documents she believed were for tax and estate planning purposes. She was told nothing about transferring ownership of her property. Within days of recovery, the defendants had sold her ranch and presented her with a check for $16,000, less than 1% of the property's value. I watched Judge Hernandez's face as James spoke, looking for any sign of sympathy or understanding. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but I thought I detected a slight tightening around her eyes when he mentioned the $16,000. "Furthermore," James continued, "this isn't just about money or property rights. Mrs. Chen's husband is buried on this ranch. The new owners plan to subdivide the property for development, which would desecrate his gravesite. The irreparable harm here goes far beyond financial considerations." Sarah's lawyer stood again. "Your Honor, we dispute every allegation Mr. Jameson has made. Mrs. Chen signed these documents willingly and with full understanding of their implications. The sale of the property was conducted legally and ethically. As for the grave site, my clients have already made arrangements with the new owners to preserve that area. I felt my blood pressure spike. Preserve that area? Robert's grave wasn't some historical monument to be preserved for tourists. It was the final resting place of my husband, surrounded by the land he'd loved and worked his entire adult life. Mrs. Blackwood, Judge Hernandez said, "What's your client's position on delaying the property transfer?" "Complete opposition, Your Honor. The sale is scheduled to close in 16 days. The buyers have arranged financing, made plans to break ground on their development project, and hired contractors who are standing by. Delaying this transfer would cause significant financial harm to innocent third parties who acted in good faith. Mr. Jameson, do you have evidence of immediate fraud sufficient to justify disrupting a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction?" James pulled out Dr. Martinez's affidavit. "Your Honor, I'd like to present testimony from Mrs. Chen's physician regarding her mental capacity at the time she signed these documents." For the next 20 minutes, James methodically presented our case. "Doctor, Martinez's statement about my medication regimen was damning. The combination of drugs I'd been taking could cause confusion, memory problems, and impaired decision-making for weeks. My neighbor Ruth Patterson had provided a sworn statement describing how disoriented I'd seemed when she'd visited during my illness. But Sarah's lawyer was prepared for every argument. She had her own medical expert, who testified that my medications, while potentially impairing, wouldn't necessarily invalidate my legal capacity to sign documents. She pointed out that I'd been lucid enough to have conversations with visitors, to manage my basic daily needs, and to understand what was being presented to me. Your Honor, Mrs. Blackwood said during her closing argument, "This case isn't about elder fraud. It's about an elderly woman who made a difficult but practical decision about her property, and now regrets that decision. Mrs. Chen may not have fully understood all the financial implications of her signature, but legal capacity doesn't require perfect understanding. It requires basic comprehension of the nature and consequences of one's actions." She gestured towards Sarah and Michael. "My clients acted out of genuine concern for Mrs. Chen's welfare. She's 73 years old, living alone on a 3,000-acre ranch 45 minutes from the nearest hospital. The property taxes and maintenance costs are substantial. Rather than becoming a burden on her family, Mrs. Chen chose to liquidate this asset and secure her financial future." I wanted to scream. Secure my financial future with $16,000? But James had warned me to stay silent, so I gripped the edge of my chair and tried to keep my expression neutral. "Furthermore," Mrs. Blackwood continued, "granting this injunction would be grossly unfair to the buyers, who are completely innocent parties. They've acted in good faith throughout this transaction. They shouldn't be penalized because Mrs. Chen has changed her mind about a legal contract she willingly signed. When it was time for James to make his final argument, he stood with the weight of our entire case on his shoulders. Your Honor, this case comes down to a simple question. Should the law protect elderly citizens from sophisticated schemes designed to separate them from their life's work? Miss Chen didn't just lose property. She lost her home, her family's legacy, and her husband's gravesite, all while she was too sick to understand what was happening. He paused, letting that sink in. The defendants would have this court believe that Mrs. Chen made an informed, rational decision to sell her ranch for essentially nothing while barely conscious from medication. That's not just implausible, it's impossible. No rational person gives away $3 million for $16,000, especially when that $3 million represents their entire life's work. Judge Hernandez had been taking notes throughout both presentations. Now she set down her pen and looked directly at me for the first time. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to ask you one direct question, and I want you to answer honestly. When you signed these documents, did you understand that you were transferring ownership of your ranch to your son and daughter-in-law? My mouth went dry. This was it, the moment everything hinged on. No, Your Honor, I did not, I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. Sarah told me they were tax documents and estate planning papers. She said they would make things easier for Michael if something happened to me. She never mentioned anything about transferring ownership, and she certainly never said anything about selling the ranch. Judge Hernandez nodded slowly. Mrs. Murdoch Chen, please stand. Sarah rose gracefully, her expression confident. Did you explicitly tell Mrs. Chen that she was signing ownership transfer documents? Sarah's composure flickered for just a moment. Your Honor, I explained that the documents would protect the family's interests and make estate planning more efficient. Mrs. Chen is an intelligent woman who was capable of reading what she signed. That's not what I asked. Did you explicitly tell her she was transferring ownership? The courtroom was dead silent. Sarah glanced at her lawyer, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. I believed she understood the implications of what she was signing. Sarah said finally. That's still not what I asked, Judge Hernandez said sharply. Yes or no, did you explicitly tell Mrs. Chen that these documents would transfer ownership of her ranch to you and your husband? Sarah's mask slipped completely. The documents spoke for themselves. I'll take that as a no. Judge Hernandez made another note, then looked up at both legal teams. I'll issue my ruling within 48 hours. This hearing is adjourned. As we filed out of the courtroom, I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in days. Judge Hernandez had seemed skeptical of Sarah's evasive answers, and our evidence was solid. But as we reached the courthouse steps, Sarah caught up with us. Margaret, she called out, her voice sickeningly sweet again. I hope you know what you're doing. This legal battle is going to cost you everything you have left. And even if you somehow win, you'll never get your precious ranch back. Those developers have lawyers too, and they're not going to give up $50 million in profits without a fight. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You're going to die in a nursing home either way, Margaret. The only question is whether you'll be broke when you get there. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, tap the red button that says subscribe. It's free and it helps me keep sharing. I stared into the cold eyes of the woman I'd once loved like a daughter and realized that whatever happened in court, I'd already lost something far more valuable than any ranch. I'd lost my family, but I'd be damned if I'd let her win without a fight. The call came at 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning that would change everything. I was feeding the chickens behind the house, trying to distract myself from the crushing anxiety of waiting for Judge Hernandez's decision when the phone rang through the open kitchen window. Margaret? James's voice was strained, different from his usual professional calm. We need to talk. Can you come to my office immediately? My heart stopped. The tone in his voice told me everything I needed to know before he said another word. She ruled against us, didn't she? Just come in, Margaret. There's more to discuss than just the ruling. The drive to his office felt like traveling through molasses. Every familiar landmark, the grain elevator, the old Methodist church, the diner where Robert and I had shared countless meals, seemed to mock me with their permanence while my entire world crumbled around me. James was waiting in his reception area when I arrived, something he'd never done before. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened, his silver hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. Sit down, Margaret, he said gently, guiding me to his office. I have Judge Hernandez's ruling, and I'm afraid it's not good news. He handed me a legal document that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all the sense it made to me. The legal language swirled together in a blur of whereas and therefore and other words that added up to one simple fact. I had lost. She found that while Sarah's misrepresentation of the documents was ethically questionable, it didn't rise to the level of legal fraud, James explained. The judge ruled that you had the mental capacity to understand what you were signing and that your signature was legally binding. I felt something die inside my chest. So that's it? They get to keep my ranch? I'm afraid so. The injunction is denied and the property transfer will proceed as scheduled. James paused, his face grave. But Margaret, there's something else. Something I discovered this morning that changes everything. I looked up at him, hardly daring to hope. I've been digging deeper into the sale itself, trying to understand how Sarah managed to navigate the zoning issues and agricultural preservation laws. What I found, he shook his head. Margaret, this goes so much deeper than we thought. He pulled out a thick folder and spread its contents across his desk. Bank statements, corporate filings, property assessments, email printouts. The buyers aren't just random developers from California. They're part of a consortium that includes 3 major real estate investment firms and a private equity company. The total value of this development project isn't the $3 million Sarah sold your ranch for. It's estimated at over $200 million. I stared at the documents, trying to process what he was telling me. $200 million. The luxury home sites are just phase one. They're planning a resort, golf courses, a private airstrip, maybe even a small shopping complex. Your ranch isn't just the centerpiece of this development. It's the linchpin that makes the entire project possible. My mind reeled. But how could Sarah know about all this? She's not some sophisticated real estate investor. James's expression darkened. That's where it gets interesting. Sarah didn't stumble onto this opportunity by accident. She's been working with these developers for over 18 months, helping them identify and acquire properties throughout the valley. She's not just your daughter-in-law who happened to sell your ranch. She's been acting as their local agent. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. She's been planning this for 18 months? At least. Look at this. He showed me a series of emails between Sarah and someone named David Castellano, apparently the lead developer. The earliest one was dated 2 years ago, and the subject line made my blood run cold. Potential acquisition targets in Willowbrook Valley. My ranch was listed third on a document attached to that email, along with detailed notes about my age, health status, and likelihood of voluntary sale. She's been studying me, I whispered, like a hunter studying prey. It gets worse. James pulled out another document. Sarah hasn't just been working as their agent. She's a full partner in the development company. She owns 15% of the entire project. When this development is complete, her share will be worth at least $30 million. $30 million. My family's legacy, sold for what amounted to pocket change, was going to make the woman I'd trusted like a daughter obscenely rich. And Michael? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. He's not listed as a partner, but there are several large deposits into his personal account that correspond with the timeline of the ranch sale. It looks like he received at least $500,000 as his cut. $500,000. My son had sold his mother's home, his father's grave, his family's heritage for $500,000. There has to be something illegal about this, I said desperately. Fraud, conspiracy, something. James was already shaking his head. That's the brilliant part. Technically, everything they did was legal, unethical, morally reprehensible, but legal. Sarah had legitimate ownership through the documents you signed. She disclosed her partnership in the development company to the buyers. The sale price was arguably fair market value for ranch land, even if it's a fraction of the development potential. So they get away with it? In criminal court, yes, but there might be another option. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. Civil court operates under different standards. We can't charge them with fraud, but we might be able to sue for breach of fiduciary duty, undue influence, or elder abuse. Hope flickered in my chest. What would that mean? It means we could potentially recover damages. Maybe not the full value of the development, but certainly more than $16,000. We could also expose what they did, make it public record. Sometimes shame can be more powerful than legal consequences. I thought about Sarah's smug expression on the courthouse steps, her casual threat about nursing homes. She'd counted on my being too old, too tired, too defeated to fight back. She'd underestimated me. What would we need to do? File a civil suit for damages. It would take longer than the injunction, probably 2 to 3 years to reach trial. The legal costs would be substantial, and there's no guarantee we'd win. But we'd have a chance? A real chance. The evidence of Sarah's deception is strong, and the disparity between what you received and what the property was actually worth is so extreme that it suggests unconscionable dealing. I stood up and walked to James's window, looking out at the town where I'd lived for most of my adult life. In a few days, the ranch would officially belong to strangers who saw it as nothing more than raw material for profit. But maybe, just maybe, I could still make Sarah and Michael pay for what they'd done. I want to do it, I said finally. I want to file the civil suit. Margaret, you need to understand what you're committing to. This will consume the next several years of your life. It will be expensive, stressful, and painful. Your family relationships will be destroyed completely. And even if we win, you'll never get your ranch back. I turned to face him. James, I'm 73 years old. I don't have many years left. and I refuse to spend them quietly accepting what's been done to me. If I can't get my home back, at least I can make sure the whole world knows what kind of people my son and daughter-in-law really are. James studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we'd better get started. But first I need to ask you something difficult. Do you have somewhere else to live? Because in 10 days, you're going to have to leave the ranch. The reality hit me like cold water. In all the legal maneuvering and emotional turmoil, I'd somehow pushed aside the practical fact that I was about to become homeless. I haven't really thought about it, I admitted. I kept hoping we'd find a way to stop this. Do you have any other family? Friends you could stay with? I mentally ran through my options. My sister lived in Florida, but we'd barely spoken in years. Most of my close friends were either dead or in assisted living facilities themselves. The few people my age who were still independent were dealing with their own health problems and couldn't take on the burden of a house guest. There's a motel in town, I said quietly. I suppose I could stay there while we fight this. James looked pained. Margaret, a motel isn't a long-term solution. You need to think seriously about your living situation. You mean I need to think about one of those assisted living places Sarah mentioned? It might be practical. No, the word came out sharper than I'd intended. I'm not giving her the satisfaction. I'll figure something out. But as I left James's office that afternoon, the weight of my situation crashed down on me fully for the first time. In 10 days, I would have to pack up 50 years of memories, say goodbye to Robert's grave, and walk away from everything I'd ever known. I was 73 years old, with $16,000 to my name and nowhere to go. But I wasn't giving up. Sarah thought she'd destroyed me, but she'd only made me angry. And an angry 73-year-old woman with nothing left to lose was apparently a force to be reckoned with. If this part also touched your heart, tell me from which place in the world you're listening to this story. The drive home took me past the sold sign that had appeared on my property sometime while I was in town. Seeing it there, bold red letters against white background, felt like watching my own obituary being posted. But underneath the grief, something else was growing. Something harder and more dangerous than sadness. Determination. Sarah had taken my home, but she hadn't taken my fight. And this fight was just getting started. Moving day came exactly 10 days later, gray and cold, like a Montana winter that had arrived too early. I stood on the front porch at dawn, watching the moving truck lumber up our gravel driveway, and felt like I was watching my own funeral procession. The movers were efficient and professional, treating my belongings with care. They probably didn't realize they were showing to the fragments of a shattered life. Each box they loaded represented decades of memories. Robert's books, our wedding china, photo albums chronicling 50 years of birthdays and holidays, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that had somehow added up to a lifetime. Ma'am, the crew chief approached me gently. He was a young man, maybe 30, with kind eyes and calloused hands. We're finished with the main house. Is there anything else you need us to take? I looked toward the hill where Robert's grave sat under the old oak tree we'd planted on our 10th anniversary. No, I said quietly. Everything important stays here. The hardest part wasn't packing my belongings or signing the final papers. It was walking through each room one last time, saying goodbye to the walls that had witnessed every significant moment of my adult life. The kitchen where I'd cooked Christmas dinners for 3 decades. The living room where my children had taken their first steps. The bedroom where Robert had died peacefully in his sleep 2 years ago, holding my hand. By noon, the house was empty except for the built-in fixtures and the ghosts of memory. I stood in the living room listening to the echo of my footsteps on the hardwood floors Robert and I had installed ourselves in 1987, and tried to memorize the way the afternoon light fell through the windows. That's when I heard the car doors slamming outside. Sarah's BMW was parked in the driveway alongside a sleek black SUV I didn't recognize. Through the window, I watched my daughter-in-law emerge wearing designer jeans and boots that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was accompanied by a man in an expensive suit, probably one of the developers coming to inspect their prize. Michael was there too, standing slightly apart from the others with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Even from a distance, I could see the guilt written across his face. They walked around the property like tourists, Sarah pointing out features and boundaries while the suited man took notes on a tablet. I watched them discuss my flower garden, my vegetable patch, the chicken coop Robert had built by hand. Everything I'd loved, they were cataloging for destruction. Finally, they approached the house. I met them at the front door, standing in the threshold like a sentry guarding sacred ground. "Margaret," Sarah's voice was syrupy sweet, the same tone she'd used when she was stealing my home. "I wasn't expecting you to still be here. The closing finished this morning." "I have until 5 o'clock, I replied evenly. "The contract specifies I can remain until end of business today." The man in the suit stepped forward. "Mrs. Chen, I'm David Castellano with Mountain Vista Development. I want you to know how much we appreciate your family's decision to sell this beautiful property. We're going to do everything we can to honor its legacy. Honor its legacy by tearing it down and building mansions for millionaires." I stared at him without responding. "We've already made arrangements to relocate your husband's grave to the town cemetery," he continued. "The headstone will be moved carefully and will cover all expenses." "Relocate his grave?" The words came out as a whisper. Sarah jumped in quickly. "It makes sense, Margaret. The cemetery in town has better maintenance, more visitors. Robert will have company there instead of being isolated out here." Company. As if Robert were lonely in the place where he'd chosen to spend eternity, surrounded by the land he'd loved more than anything except his family. "You can't move him," I said. "He wanted to be buried here. This was his home." "Unfortunately, Mrs. Chen," Castellano said with practiced sympathy, "the gravesite sits right in the middle of our planned golf course. We can't build around it for obvious reasons." A golf course. They were going to build a golf course over the spot where my husband rested. "However," Sarah added brightly, "we'll make sure he has a lovely spot in the town cemetery. Maybe somewhere with a nice view of the mountains." I felt something break inside me. Not the slow, gradual fracture I'd been experiencing for weeks, but a sudden, complete shattering. They weren't just stealing my home. They were desecrating my husband's final resting place so rich strangers could play golf. "Get out," I said quietly. "Excuse me?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Get out!" The words exploded from me with 50 years of pent-up rage. "Get out of my house! Get off my land! You've stolen everything else! You don't get to stand here and gloat about it!" Michael stepped forward. "Mom, please!" "Don't you dare call me that!" I turned the full force of my fury on my son. "You sold your father's grave, Michael. You sold the place where your children learned to ride horses. You sold your sister's memory, your own childhood, 50 years of our family's life, and for what? Money. A bigger house in Seattle. It's not about money. It's all about money," I screamed. "You sold your soul and your mother's home for Sarah's $30 million, and you don't even have the courage to look me in the eye while you do it." Castellano cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should come back another time." "There won't be another time," I said, my voice deadly quiet now. "You've taken my house, you've taken my land, and apparently you think you can take my husband too. But you haven't taken my fight." I looked directly at Sarah. "I'm filing a civil lawsuit against you for fraud, elder abuse, and breach of fiduciary duty. I'm going to spend every penny I have left and every day I have remaining making sure the whole world knows exactly what kind of person you are." Sarah's composure finally cracked. "You can't prove anything, Margaret. Everything we did was legal." "Maybe. But legal and moral aren't the same thing. And I'm going to make sure that everyone in this county, everyone in this state, knows that Sarah Murdoch Chen is the kind of woman who steals from elderly widows." "You're just making this harder on yourself," Sarah snapped. "You could have taken your check, moved into a nice facility, and lived out your remaining years in comfort. Instead, you're going to bankrupt yourself fighting a battle you can't win." "I'm 73 years old," I replied. "I've buried my husband and my daughter. I've survived cancer, drought, recession, and 40 years of Montana winters. Do you really think you scare me?" I stepped closer to her, close enough to see the uncertainty flicker in her eyes. "I may not win, Sarah, but I'm going to make sure you pay a price for what you've done. Every time someone Googles your name, they're going to find the story of how you defrauded an old woman. Every business deal, every social event, every school function for your children. People will know who you really are. Are you threatening me? I'm promising you." I looked at Michael. "Both of you." Michael finally found his voice. Mom, I never wanted it to go this far. If there was a way to undo this. There was a way, I cut him off. You could have said no. You could have chosen your mother over your wife's greed. You could have been the man your father raised you to be. I shook my head sadly. But you made your choice, and now you get to live with it. I walked past all of them to my car, where I'd loaded the last few boxes of items too precious to trust to the movers. As I started the engine, I rolled down the window for one final word. You can have the house, Sarah. You can have the land. You can even move my husband's body. But you'll never have what Robert and I built here. Love can't be developed or subdivided or sold to the highest bidder. I drove away without looking back, but I could see them in my rearview mirror. 3 people standing in front of a house they'd stolen, trying to figure out what they'd actually won. What comes next is even stronger. And to not miss the ending, tap the subscribe button now. It's free and you'll be with me in every new story. The Pineview Motel sat on the outskirts of town, a relic from the 1970s that had seen better decades. My new home was room 17, with wood-paneled walls, a small refrigerator that hummed constantly, and a view of the highway where trucks rumbled past at all hours. It wasn't much, but it was mine. That evening I sat on the narrow bed and called James Jameson. I'm ready to file that civil suit, I told him. All of it. Fraud, elder abuse, breach of fiduciary duty, everything we discussed. Margaret, are you sure? The emotional toll alone. I'm sure. Sarah thinks she's destroyed me, but she's wrong. She's just made me angry, and she's about to learn that you should never underestimate an angry old woman with nothing left to lose. As I hung up the phone, I realized something had fundamentally changed inside me. The grief was still there, along with the sense of loss and betrayal, but something else had taken root in the ruins of my old life. Purpose. Sarah had taken my home, but she'd given me something in return, a mission. For whatever time I had left on this earth, I was going to fight. Not just for myself, but for every elderly person who'd ever been targeted by someone who thought they were too old, too weak, too trusting to fight back. I opened my laptop and began typing my story, starting with the words that would eventually reach thousands of people. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 73 years old. My daughter-in-law stole my $3 million ranch and handed me a $16,000 check. But that's not the end of my story. It's just the beginning. Outside my motel window, trucks continued their endless journey down the highway. But inside room 17, a different kind of journey was just getting started. The war for justice had begun, and this old woman wasn't backing down.